Today I will be talking about deep moonquakes, and the data that I will be looking at in this presentation comes from the instrument that you see on the right. That is the Apollo 12 passive seismic experiment photographed during the deployment. Sorry, it's how I... Oh, there we go. It's upside down. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. Okay, so to give some background, deep moonquakes what deep moonquakes are and how they were detected. The Apollo lunar surface experiment package was deployed during the Apollo missions, and it comprises, among other things, 5 seismic stations which were placed between 1969 and 1972. 4 of those, which are represented by the red dots in the equilateral triangle on the near side, recorded continuously until 1977, and these provide the bulk of our lunar seismic record. Over 12,000 events have been identified in the lunar seismic record, and more than half of these are deep moonquakes, which are repeated seismic events that occur at focal depths between 700 kilometers and 1,200 kilometers, roughly. These events originate from discrete kilometer scale nests or clusters, the epicenters of which are denoted in blue for the nests that occur on the near side of the moon, and then bright green for the nests that occur on the far side. As you can tell, the near side nests far outnumber the far side nests. And the question that still remains unanswered is, what is the focal mechanism behind deep moonquakes? But the kind of sub-question that I'm going to be looking at today is, can we identify subgroups within the known nests, which indicates that there could be different focal mechanisms in a single nest? Right side this time. Okay, so the method that I'm using is called the wavelet scattering transform, and I like to refer to it as a more hands-on statistical non-machine learning approach to machine learning, in which you have an input signal. Here I'm using event time series from specific seismic data, and convolving it with a family of complex wavelets. And these wavelets behave as individual bandpass filters. One complex wavelet is dilated until it spans all of the frequencies that we're looking at. And then when you convolve this family of complex wavelets with your input data to the first order, you get a set of coefficients that are analogous to power spectra. So because each individual wavelet corresponds to a specific frequency band. When you take this to the second order, so when you repeat this, you can get basically the time dependence of each of these frequency bands. So what we end up with is a set of coefficients that really accurately describes really high dimensional data, and you can do statistical analysis with these coefficients or sequencing. The data that I'm looking at are events from the A1 and the A8 nests. So these are the 2 largest nests that we have in the current lunar seismic record. I am looking only at the Apollo 12 vertical component. So I'm looking at 1 station and 1 component. And I'm also controlling for the response mode of the instrument to control as many factors as possible. The other control that I'm inputting is that I'm only looking at high signal to noise ratio events from each cluster. And there are examples of these on the right side of the slide. Because as you can tell, low SNR events from both A1 and A8 don't typically have a lot of information because they usually consist of bit swaps that are only barely above the noise. Whereas high signal to noise ratio events, there are 19 of which in the A1 and 11 of which in the A8, so 30 total. They give us a lot of information about how these nests could be different. So what we know about the nests from these events are that in general, A1 events are longer. They're longer in duration. They're longer in event rise time. So from the onset of the event to the peak, and they're longer in the event decay time. They're also higher in amplitude in general. And what we see is that when we look at their event occurrence during the lunar cycle, A8 events occur during lunar apogee, so when the moon is furthest away, and A1 occurs on the opposite side at lunar perigee. So to describe, before I get into what this is, before I get into the data analysis, I'll describe what this is. So on the left, you have the data, the time series data envelope for all 30 events that we're looking at. In the middle, we have the sequenced first order scattering coefficients. And then on the right, we have the designation, whether they are A1 or A8. And I sequenced by the coefficient at which the entire set peaks for each event. And then if it's the same, I sort by amplitude. In general, for the first order, it sorts by signal to noise ratio, and that makes it pretty easy to differentiate between the A1 and the A8 deep moonquakes. As you could see, all of the A8 deep moonquakes are relegated to the top, and all of where the lower signal to noise ratio events typically are, as we would expect, and all of the A1 are at the bottom. But the first order doesn't have the most information. The second order generally does. And with that, we're seeing a little bit more mixing. So a quick difference, there are more scattering coefficients for the second order because we are looking at time dependence for a bunch of different frequency bands. In general, your A1 events have higher frequency bands and less varied time spans, and A8 has lower frequency bands with time spans across which and the time spans across which these frequencies are observed are more varied. However, there are some exceptions, and that is surprising because these are the highest signal to noise ratio events that we have for both the A1 and the A8 events, and they are not really neatly separated out into two groups. What happens when we reintroduce the low signal to noise ratio events, just to see. This is the first order again. And what we are able to see is that it's really hard to sort out the low signal to noise ratio A1 events from the rest of the A8 events. So in general, you cannot tell the difference between a low SNR A1 event and an A8 event, which if you look at this visually could have been predicted. And then when we look at the second order, you are seeing various subgroups within both the A1 and the A8 deep moonquake events, but there is no actual segregation between the two known clusters. And yes, okay. So the takeaway slide is that scattering transforms, they analyze both frequency content of a time event, a time series event, and the time dependency. And what this is showing is that A1 and A8 events have way more in common when we look at the low signal to noise ratio events. And then also, this is their event occurrence when you look at all of the events, not just the high signal to noise ratio. And while there is a pattern of them occurring at opposite ends of the lunar cycle, there is considerable overlap. And this indicates the possibility that there are several subclusters that we have not yet identified within the two largest known nests. This is definitely a work in progress. So I will leave this off here, and I look forward to any comments or questions. Thank you very much.